I'd like to welcome you to what I believe is the 163rd Interpreter Scripture Roundtable. This is one that will be focused on Lesson 19 in the 2016 Gospel Doctrine Manual, the one focused on the Book of Mormon, and specifically on chapters 18 through 24 of the Book of Mosiah. My name is Daniel Peterson, and with me in this roundtable discussion are, starting at the left, at least on my screen, Martin Tanner and McKay White and Steve Densley. And so we are here to look at a really wonderful story in the Book of Mormon. This is one of the really exciting passages, I think, movie quality stuff. I mean, and I will say just generally that the Book of Mosiah is amazing to me because it's so complex. There's so many things going on, so many groups bypassing one another in the wilderness, and so many little stories. But what impresses me, one of the things that impresses me about it is how it all comes together at the end, kind of like the resolution of a chord in music, I suppose. And I think when you remember that this was all dictated, if you believe the critics, it was made up by Joseph Smith over the course of just a few days, just whizzing along, dictating as fast as he could. Pretty astonishing achievement. I find it, frankly, an implausible achievement. I don't believe that. But it is a complex story. And one way of demonstrating its complexity, I've sometimes asked people when I've taught these chapters in Gospel Doctrine class, try diagramming the action. Just try following these little groups through. Create a sort of flow chart. It's amazingly complex. Quite a narrative achievement. Now, easier to imagine if it's actually true history, because history is complex. But if you're just making it up on the fly, good grief, this is a pretty elaborate task to undertake. And I find that very, very difficult to imagine. Very difficult to imagine myself able to pull it off, let alone this Joseph Smith with his 2.5 months of formal education. Just doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, we'll start with chapter 18. This involves Alma, who is, well, I think we've asked McKay if he would give us a little background overview of the story. So we know, who is this guy? For those who are just coming into the story, as I often do with mysteries on television, you know, episode 2, I spend the whole time trying to figure out who are these people and what happened. And then I usually never get to see the concluding episode 3, so I just spend my entire life in a state of perplexity. Anyone who doesn't know what's going on now, maybe we can help them out. Okay, would you want to do that?
Firstly, I agree with you that this is a very exciting part in the Book of Mormon. If you consider what's happening here, we're really at the genesis of a significant change in the course of Nephite religion. That we have Alma here in the land of Nephi. You'll remember that back under the reign of the first king Mosiah, that Mosiah left the land of Nephi, found the land of Zarahemla, and after some time there, a group of people wanted to go back to the land of Nephi. Those people, led by Zeniff, set up in the city of Nephi. Zeniff's son Noah became king, and the small kingdom that they had there fell into wickedness. In the last lesson, we had Abinadi come to teach about Jesus Christ. And one thing I find interesting is that his purpose seems to be very similar to what King Benjamin taught to the Nephites up in Zarahemla. He reintroduced to the Nephites there the worship of Jesus Christ, the law of Moses pointing us towards Jesus Christ, the need to covenant with Christ. And here Abinadi is doing the same thing with this group of Nephites that broke off to go back to the city of Nephi. He's again pointing them towards Jesus Christ, the whole purpose of the law of Moses. A very different result here. Here, Abinadi has essentially only one convert, which is Alma, who was a priest in the court of Noah. He believed Abinadi, tried to stand up for Abinadi, and was driven out and threatened with death. He then proceeds to teach people in the area about Jesus Christ, the things that Abinadi had taught. He has much more success than Abinadi did. And here, starting in chapter 18, he introduces to them the idea of a covenant with God in their faith in Jesus Christ, and we have the formation of a church, which is called the Church of Christ, and this is where we see now a big change in Nephite religion. Prior to this time, there was no real church organization, and now Alma is starting this idea of a Church of Christ, which will continue until the coming of Christ almost 150 years later. So this is where we're at. Alma is in hiding at a place called the Waters of Mormon. He's teaching the people in secret, and he's slowly gaining converts to the gospel of Christ.
I found my mic muted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
That sounds like something right out of commercial television. Anyway, yes. So people are going out to this area, a place called Mormon. It's interesting because Mormon is a rather important word among Latter-day Saints. But we first meet it not as the designator of a person, the general Mormon, and not certainly as an adjective referring to people who belong to the church, but as a place name. It's a place where people go to hunt, and there's a fountain of pure water, and so on. And so the people come out there, and Alma realizes that he's beginning to see the formation of a whole new community. It's not just a community of people who happen to be ethnically Nephite, but a community of people who've consciously chosen to join it. And so that's sort of the beginning of a church. It's a little different than they've seen before. Any comments generally about this chapter 18 and what goes on there? Steve, did you want to talk about baptism? We could do it here or whenever you'd like.
Yeah, I have a number of things I'm interested in this chapter. We talk a lot about these verses as being the I guess example of the baptismal covenant. We also talk about the sacrament prayer as being a renewal of our baptismal covenant, and it can be a little confusing as to why that is. The wording is not exactly the same. Of course, our wording of our modern baptisms is very simple, and then even the wording of the sacrament prayer doesn't look exactly like what we hear Alma talking about here. But as you go through, if I had a table, I'd hold it up so we could go through and compare these. But if we think about the sacrament prayer, where it says that we're willing to take upon us the name of Christ and always remember Him and keep His commandments, that we may have His Spirit to be with us. And then we look at, starting in verse 8, it talks about desirous to come into the fold of God and be called His people. And then in verse 9 it talks about standing as witnesses of God at all times, in all things, in all places. That sounds a lot like taking upon ourselves the name of the Son, being called His people, standing as witnesses. And then when we think about always remembering Him, I wonder if verse 8, where it talks about being willing to bear one another's burdens, and willing to mourn with those that mourn and comfort those that stand in need of comfort, that we see in verse 9. I wonder if that's not indicative of remembering Christ when we bear one another's burdens and mourn with those that mourn. And it's interesting too that it uses the word willing, to bear one another's burdens and willing to mourn. That word willing appears in the sacrament prayer. And then we take a covenant of obedience. We say, covenant that will keep the commandments. In verse 10, it says that we will serve Him and keep His commandments. And then in the sacrament prayer, the reciprocal part of that covenant is that we may always have His Spirit to be with us. And in verse 10, it ends with, we do all of these things that He may pour out His Spirit more abundantly upon you. And so when we compare it in that way, it does seem to track pretty closely with our modern sacrament prayer. And so I think that it can be said that this, to the extent that the sacrament prayer is a recommittal or a reaffirming our covenants that we made at baptism. And in Mosiah, we see that those are the same covenants that they're making at the waters of Mormon. These all fit together quite well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are marvelous verses, I think, on a lot of levels. It's such a wonderful description of what a community of saints ought to be, too. A community that comes together and is willing to mourn with those that mourn, bear one another's burdens, they may be light, comfort those that stand in need of comfort, stand as witnesses. So many of these are functions that I've seen fulfilled by saints in wards and communities that I've been in over my lifetime. A remarkable level of shared concern and shared caring for people when people falter, when their health fails, when they suffer a loss or in mourning, and then also standing as witnesses. This is wonderful stuff. So it's a text that we often use when we're inviting people. At least I have when I've talked to people who are contemplating baptism and so on. I say this is the kind of community that you're joining. It's not only a matter of affirming your faith in God and your acceptance of the covenants, but you're joining a community in which we live together as Latter-day Saints and try to strengthen one another. So I think it's a wonderful passage. Any other comments about this episode, this situation where you have the beginnings of the first Nephite church?
Dan, I have a quick comment about baptism and the questions about that ritual happening still way before the time of Christ. I've had several emails recently in connection with my radio show about that, not specifically in this lesson, but about prior ones where people are reading about baptism centuries before the time of Christ. How can that be? How can that be? And I think the simplest way to describe it is that today we find this huge dichotomy between Judaism and Christianity. And so whenever you translate a ritual immersion or cleansing in a Christian context, it's always baptism, which comes from the Greek word, which essentially means the same thing that the Hebrew words did in the Old Testament that talk about ritual cleansing. But of course, if you talk about baptism in the Old Testament, Jewish scholars and adherents just pitch a fit because that's not right. And if you start talking about ritual cleansing in the New Testament, Christians are really, really unhappy about it because there's this huge dichotomy. And one of the wonderful things about the Book of Mormon is that it has a position of continuity of the gospel, not completely, but at least in some sense. McKay's pointed out, and Steve has pointed out that there are, some differences here, of course, between the church that's been formed. But you have these ideas that the Book of Mormon presents as continuous into New Testament times and beyond, and that's entirely appropriate. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and I'll give you two examples. The first one is that if an innocent Christian person, translated 2 Kings, I think it's chapter 5, about Elisha going in and cleansing himself in the water 7 times. And that happened about 800 BC. Elisha was around, and the Book of Mormon people would have remembered his story, and that would have been part of the brass plates. That could easily be translated as some kind of baptism or cleansing or immersion. And when John the Baptist came on the scene, you don't see this statement by the Jews who were coming to him, wow, John, he's doing this new thing. Nobody's ever heard of it before. There's just been nothing like it. Look, he's taking people, he's putting them in the water, and he's cleansing them. you don't hear any statement about this. This was perfectly natural to the people who came to John the Baptist, because the idea of ritual cleansing is found in many, many places in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And it's sort of repurposed and used a little different way amongst the people in the Book of Mormon and amongst Christians, but that's okay too. I've used the example before of the Old Testament's Passover is the New Testament's sacrament or Eucharist, and the Old Testament's ritual cleansing is the New Testament's baptism. And so we shouldn't be troubled or worried at all about this. As a matter of fact, this is the only place in Scripture where the translation is consistent from Old Testament times to New Testament times. And frankly, to me, that's the best translation. If the translation hadn't been baptism, it wouldn't have made as much sense and wouldn't have worked as well. So to me, that translation is comforting and an air of authenticity. And with that, back to you, Dan.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think Jewish ritual baths are called mikvahs or mikvaot, and I think, well, why not call them baptismal fonts? Well, obviously that would offend Jews today. Okay, so why not call baptismal fonts mikvahs or mikvaot? They really serve in most ways the same functions. And you know, one of the persistent rumors is that John the Baptist may have been at Qumran, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls community. And if you go there, actually, they show a little videotape in which John the Baptist plays a role. He was never shown, but they're talking about this guy who used to be with us, and isn't that this John the Baptist who was just executed? Now, whether he was there or not, I don't know, but the fact is, you go around the ruins of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls people were, and there are multiple mikvahs, or mikvaot, the places where people would go down and be immersed in the water. And the fact that they can even raise the idea that John the Baptist may have been there, and that may have influenced his use of baptism, whether it did or not doesn't matter. The fact is that scholars now recognize there's a continuity, and it may have been, you know, like a continuity of, we're only talking about a few miles apart and at exactly the same time when Jewish ritual immersions are taking place and at least proto-Christian baptisms are taking place. Right down there by Jericho and the Jordan River, and Qumran just a little bit to the south. So, so there's not a nice hard and fast distinction between Jewish ritual immersion, as you say, and Christian baptism.
You know, Dan, I think I remember you attending the conference last year on Jesus in the Temple. Am I right?
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah, that's right. Professor James Charlesworth was kind of the keynote speaker there, and then there was also one of the foremost archaeologists in Israel that was there. I forget his name. But I read Professor Charlesworth's book, Jesus in the Temple, before that conference, and so I was so interested to talk to him about that. I went up and talked with him and the archaeologist about baptism, because I read this in his book, and so I pulled this out. It says that according to Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 5, it correctly reports that before one enters this pure place, or the temple, this is during the time of Jesus, one must immerse himself in a mikvah, a Jewish bath for ritual purification, and change clothes. So before people were going to the temple, they were immersing themselves in they have these pools around the temple. There's at least one of them is still there today. I saw a YouTube video about it the other day with the guy walking down in there. It doesn't look that unlike what we have in our stake centers. Mm-hmm. And people would go all the way down under the water and come back up, and then they would wear new clothing. Mm-hmm. So I asked Professor Charlesworth and the archaeologist, about this, and I said, well, is that where John is getting this? Because as Martin pointed out, nobody's surprised at all that John's going around and baptizing anybody. The gospel writers don't take any time to explain what baptism is or why he's doing it or where it's coming from. Everybody just assumes that this is something that everyone understands. and they were both adamant that this is not baptism. A mikveh washing is not baptism. John the Baptist was doing something new, and I thought that was very strange. And so I've looked further into this. And as I recall, I don't want to be unfair to Professor Charlesworth, but as I recall, one of the reasons he gave me for it being different, a new thing, was that in a mikveh bath, you're just kind of doing it on your own. You just go under the water and come up, and John is there, taking people under the water. So this is different. Well, as I've looked more into it. Well, one of the things that's striking to me about that occurred to me, in the book of Moses, we read about Adam being baptized by the Holy Ghost, and as you think about that, if you were to watch Adam going through this process, it might look very much like a Jew going down under the water on his own and coming back up. So the tradition of the Jews maybe going down under the water on their own and coming back up is probably not unlike what is described in the book of Moses, but there is a tradition of Jews witnessing a baptism, so it's not strictly true to say that they just do it all on their own. And modern Orthodox Jews practice baptism. They call it tevilah, and they use a mikveh, and it is used for ritual cleansing, after a woman's menstrual period or after she's had a baby. And I thought this was very fascinating. When someone converts to Judaism, they will go down into a mikveh as part of joining the Jewish religion. Because I think that's so significant, because one of the distinctions people have drawn between the ritual washings we read about in the Old Testament and what John the Baptist is doing is they're saying, well, John the Baptist is initiating a new practice, and this is a new group that's forming, and as part of joining this new group, you go through this process, and so that's one of the ways in which it's new. That doesn't appear to be so, at least if we take what the modern Orthodox or Jews are doing. And I came across an article that was talking about this. It's from a website called myjewishlearning.com, where some modern Jews is describing the reason for what they do currently. And the current practice, I think, it's so interesting to hear them describe it. It says, the water of the mikveh is designed to ritually cleanse a person from deeds of the past. The convert is considered by Jewish law to be like a newborn child. There is a second layer of meaning to mikveh. It marks the beginning of the ascent to an elevated religious state. This function of mikveh goes beyond the basic purpose of purification, and anthropologists refer to this threshold of higher social status as liminality. The person at this moment of transition is a liminal or threshold person. If we take this graphic metaphor a step further, we can sense that the mikveh is a spiritual womb. The human fetus is surrounded by water. It does not yet live. The water breaks in a split second, and the child emerges into a new world. As soon as the convert immerses and emerges, he is a Jew in every respect, and it cites to the Talmud, Yevamot 47b. And then it goes on and talks about the construction of it. It says the mikveh must be built into the ground, or the structure of a building. It must hold a minimum of 24 cubic feet of water. The depth must be such as to enable an average adult to stand upright and have the water reach at least 11 inches above the waist, so that immersion can be performed without breaking or without back-breaking contortions. So the modern Jews are practicing something that they think helps cleanse them, that's reminiscent of a birth, that helps them to join a new community, and in a font that's down below the ground. To me that sounds a whole lot like what we're doing now. And it's interesting when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, he talks about baptism as being born again. So this modern tradition the Jews have about the water being sort of like the water of the womb, and this is like a new birth. That seems to be that seems to have ancient grounding as well. And then, Dan, you mentioned Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Of course, those weren't discovered until the mid-20th century. So if people would criticize Joseph Smith for being anachronistic and putting something in the Bible that nobody nobody would think it would be there unless you're just kind of assuming that baptism was ancient without justification from the Bible. It looks like it might be a mistake, because Joseph Smith is coming from a Christian background where where baptism is presumed, and the presumption at the time of Joseph Smith would have been that John the Baptist, as it is today, that John the Baptist is the one who started baptism. But since then, lots of documents have been found. We've got not just Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Nag Hammadi Library and Gnostic texts that have been discovered. There's a reference in the Apocalypse of Adam, Gnostic text, about 3 heavenly messengers visiting Adam and Eve. And these are 3 heavenly messengers that are associated with the rite of baptism, and that Adam, in turn, teaches his son Seth about baptism by virtue of this visit of these heavenly messengers. Matt Roper spoke in the 2006 Fair Mormon Conference. About the conference address was about these ancient Christian traditions that a whole lot of them look like what we're doing today, and so I want to read one paragraph from that I think is pertinent to this discussion. He says, while the Bible gives no indication that Adam was ever baptized, other ancient Jewish, Christian, and later Mandean texts discuss his baptism. In some accounts, Adam is baptized after death before he can enter paradise of heaven. In other accounts, as in the Latter-day Saint Book of Moses, Adam is baptized while in mortality. According to the early Syrian father Ephraim, in baptism, Adam found again that glory that was among the trees of Eden. He went down and received it out of the water. He put it on and went up and was adorned therein. Man fell in the midst of paradise, and in baptism, compassion restored him. They clothed themselves with leaves of necessity, but the merciful had pity on their beauty, and instead of leaves, he clothed them with glory of water. One interesting account can be found in the canonical prayer book of the Mandeans. In Mandean teaching, Anhibil Ziwa, an Uthra, or angel, was sent from God to teach Adam and baptize him. This is the baptism wherewith Adam, the first man, was baptized by Hibil Ziwa. Any man who has strength thereto, and who loveth his soul, let him come and go down into the Jordan, be baptized, receive the pure sign, put on robes of radiant light, and set a fresh wreath upon his head. And Adam descended into the Jordan and submerged himself thrice. When Adam came up out of the water, the heavenly messenger took him by the right hand, and he grasped his hand in Custa, and seated him before him and recited the sealing prayers. This is the limit, the end of baptism, which came into this world. The baptism wherewith Hibil Ziwa baptized Adam, the first man, and it was preserved in the ages for the elect righteous, for it was written down in the scroll. In Mandean Book of Adam, called the Ginza, an angel teaches Adam the way back to his heavenly home. When he, Adam, heard this from him, he was overjoyed. He himself had brought him hither, and now he became his guide to the other world. He undressed him and clothed him with his garment. He escorted him, made him ascend, and set him up in the house of the mighty life. He took him by the right hand and put him in charge of his own treasures. The Babylonians and the Egyptians also had forms of ritual washings, and the Mayans had some ritual baptisms. I remember, anybody goes to Chichen Itza, if you're wandering around there, you may stumble into this this hole with some stairs going down into it that's set in front of one of the temple entrances, and it looks a whole lot like a baptismal font. It looks a whole lot like something that somebody might wash themselves in before they enter into the temple. Mm-hmm. But in Mormon's Codex, John Sorensen writes about this. He says, a form of baptism was common among the Maya, the Aztecs, and no doubt other peoples at the time of the Spanish conquest. Herrera reported, baptism has been found in Yucatan, and in their tongue it means to be born again. They held it in such great devotion and reverence that no one failed to receive it. They thought they received it in a pure disposition to be good, and not to be harmed by the demons, and to attain glory, which they hoped for. It was given them between the ages of 3 and 12, and no one was married without receiving it. The last thing I want to mention before I be quiet here and let you guys talk. I've been trying to find more clear example of the Jews. I saw these just kind of references in some of the Jewish websites I was looking at on the internet to baptism sort of starting with Moses, and that the Jews see the Jewish nation as beginning with Moses, and there are some traditions of that process beginning with a baptism, and of course we read about the metaphor of the children of Israel crossing through the Red Sea, and that sort of being a metaphor for baptism. But apparently there are some more literal references. I wish I could. I didn't have time to go and actually verify these references to the Torah, or to the Talmud. There are references here, and for whatever reason I couldn't find them online. And there's also a reference to Maimonides, the medieval Jewish scholar, in his Mishnah Torah. So let me just read these couple of paragraphs that talk about ancient baptism, and with the caveat that I haven't been able to verify these references. This comes from a website called Torch, Connecting Jews and Judaism. It says, the truth is, and this might shock some of you, that each and every Jew originally descends from converts. That's right, you read that correctly. We all come from converts. You see, the scriptural source for the main requirements of Jewish conversion is the original conversion of the entire Jewish nation at Mount Sinai. Our ancestors converted to the new religion of Judaism by taking an oath to accept upon themselves and all future generations to observe all of the 613 commandments. They said, Na ashe v'nishima, we will do and we will hear. See Exodus 24:7. And they entered into the covenant through circumcision, ritual immersion, and offering sacrifices to God. See the Talmud in Keraisos 9a. So there's this covenant of obedience, and then they have circumcision, and then ritual immersion, and then they offer sacrifices. Of course, our sacrifice is broken heart and a contrite spirit, I guess, symbolized as we take the sacrament. Then it says, as Maimonides writes in his Mishnah Torah in the Laws of Forbidden Relationships, chapter 13, laws 1 through 4, the Israelites entered into the covenant with three things: circumcision, immersion, and sacrifices. Circumcision was performed in Egypt, as it is written, and all uncircumcised males shall not eat of it, the paschal lamb. Immersion, ritual purification, was performed in the desert before the giving of the Torah, as it is written, and you shall sanctify yourselves today and tomorrow. And at this time sacrifices were also brought. So too for all generations, a Gentile who wishes to enter into the covenant, to find shelter under the wings of the Shekinah, the divine presence, and to accept upon himself the yoke of Torah, requires circumcision, immersion, and acceptance of a sacrifice at the time of the temple. And so when we think about baptism as being a new thing, because John the Baptist was creating sort of a new group of people, and then later the Christians were creating a church, it doesn't appear to be anachronistic at all for Alma to be doing the same thing. So we may ask ourselves, well, why wasn't this really done before? Nephi talks about baptism, but it's not really clear that anybody does it until Alma in this chapter. And an answer might be that the Nephites kind of saw themselves as all being part of a covenant people, but then at this point in the Book of Mormon, everybody's kind of breaking up, and we actually have Nephites that go over and join the Lamanites. After Mosiah leaves, goes to Zarahemla, and there's a group of Nephites that's left there, and then the group comes back. Well, a group comes back, Zenith and his people, and they try to form a new community there. Alma sort of breaks off from that community, goes out to the waters of Mormon, and he says, all right, if you want to be a covenant people, what do you have against baptism? And they all clap their hands. They don't say, what are you talking about? What does baptism mean? They appear to know exactly what baptism is, and they appear not to have been doing it. And so Alma baptizes them, and so this is the first time we see a church form. Mm-hmm. And it may be because of this issue we have with the way that the group dynamics is working, that Alma's sort of breaking off from a group and forming a distinct group of people who are maybe renewing covenants that maybe they had understood that they should be keeping, but then it's a new initiation into this new group. But that's not anachronistic if we take what we're finding in ancient texts that we're only finding in the 20th century, and then some of these references in the Talmud, that that was what people did when they joined into this new nation of Jews, or Israelites, was to go through a ritual immersion that was symbolic of their entering into a new covenant and becoming a new people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good comments. Well, the king notices something's going on. So at the end of chapter 18, the king said that Alma was stirring up the people to rebellion against him. Therefore, he sent his army to destroy them. For him, he's mingled, as probably everybody did, religion and politics, right? So he's got his priests who are part of his royal court and so on. So to rebel against that priesthood and their teaching is to rebel against him. He has a point that, in a sense, this has political ramifications. So he sends the army out after them, but the army doesn't find them. We get into chapter 19. I'm going to presume that we can move on now to chapter 19 because we've got several more chapters to cover. That the army went out looking and they couldn't find them, which to me suggests this is difficult terrain. I mean, it's not obvious to find these people. You get lost. People are getting lost all the time in the book of Mosiah. Meanwhile, there is real disorder. I mean, there's a division among the people, and this man by the name of Gideon pursues after King Noah and wants to kill him. And then I love this scene. There's some really sort of ironic comments about King Noah. Verse 7 of chapter 19, the king cried out in the anguish of his soul, saying, Gideon, spare me, for the Lamanites are upon us. There's an invading army coming, they can see, and they will destroy us. Yea, they will destroy my people. Now, the king was not so much concerned about his people, of course, as he was about his own life. Nevertheless, Gideon did spare his life. And so the king commanded the people that they should flee. And here's another funny little note in verse 9. I'm sure I don't know that it's meant to be funny, but the king commanded the people that they should flee before the Lamanites, and he himself did go before them. So as they're fleeing from the Lamanites, who's in the lead, running the fastest? It's King Noah. He's a hero. He's leading his people. But they go out into the wilderness, and then you get even more complexities because then some of them abandon their wives and children, and so on. Does anyone want to make any general comments about chapter 19?
Well, Dan, this concept of abandoning the wives and children is kind of interesting in light of something that Brent Gardner pointed to. He said, yet possibly there was something else behind this apparently cowardly command. Sheil and Matthews discuss the settlement of Chichen Itza, a city settled long after the close of the Book of Mormon. Quote, we also suspect that most of the refugees, migrants, were nobles, because the accounts say that the migrants went without their wives so that they married local women during their migrations. That's the end of the quote. So Brandt makes the point that there's some not really precedence, I guess, because it would have come hundreds of years later, yeah. But this idea that leaving the women and the children and going into a new community allows them to form alliances with the people in this new community, and that that's apparently something that the Mayans in Chichen Itza did hundreds of years later. And so
that's eventually what will happen here. That these
right.
They marry Lamanite women eventually to replace their previous wives, and then they end up sort of in leadership positions in their new community as well, because they have no great loyalty to their old one. And the course of this, of course, King Noah suffers death by fire, which had been prophesied by Abinadi the prophet, and it does happen. They're so sick of him that they do him in, so he doesn't end well. And then the Nephites who remain in the city come into bondage. They end up paying these enormous tributes. They become tributaries to the Lamanite king, who's feeding himself off of their labors. It's a great deal for him. And so that's the situation, essentially, that is set up when we first find them in the book of Mosiah, right? Any further comments about chapter 19? McKay, anything you want to say?
Just a little bit, and not restricted just to chapter 19, but consider the fact that we know that at various places in the Book of Mormon, we get the comment about how difficult it is to record on the plates, and at times there's scarcity of ore and such. And so we get the sense that anything that Mormon and later Moroni recorded on these plates was for a reason. They had a real purpose for putting things down. And at any time, I think it's valuable to stop and ask yourself, why did Mormon include this? He didn't put anything extraneous. Why is it here? And in these chapters, we get a lot of comings and goings. These people went and did this. Those people went and did that. There's no explicit teaching of gospel principles. But as we look at what happens in chapter 19 and the subsequent chapters, what we see is a clear account that the words of the prophets are fulfilled. We've seen, read what Abinadi said, all the prophecies that he made, and in this subsequent account, though it seems like just a narrative, we see that every single prophecy comes to pass. King Noah's life is valued as a garment in a furnace. The people are brought into bondage. The Lord is slow to hear their cries. Everything is brought to pass. And as we read these things, though it seems just like a narrative, we are seeing the fact that the prophets are always right, essentially.
It's good reason to take their warnings seriously, and that's one of the points of the Book of Mormon, is to show that their prophecies do come true. Therefore, next time you hear such a prophecy, take it seriously. All right, so we find a situation where this little Nephite colony has been subjugated by the Lamanites, and then in chapter 20, the Lamanite daughters are abducted by the priests of Noah, who find themselves out in the wilderness without their wives. They've abandoned them, and so in this case they move on and they grab some more women. This is actually, there are lots of ancient stories about this sort of thing, the so-called rape of the Sabine women, which is one of the early formative stories of ancient Rome. It's not really about rape as we think about it today. It's just basically seizing these women and making them wives. I understand that the musical or play Seven Brides for Seven Brothers is based loosely on that story. So it's an old motif, and it happens here. And then the Lamanites wage war upon Limhi and his people, but they're repulsed and pacified. So it's a tense state of oppression and occasional warfare between this little Nephite colony and their Lamanite overlords. They're really in bondage, and it's uneasy. It's never quite stable. So if there are no comments about chapter 20, we can move on to chapter 21, where Limhi's people are smitten and defeated by the Lamanites. They meet Ammon and are converted. Okay, so this is a turning point in their history. The Lamanites at first go right up to the line. It's really letter of the law here. They note they can't slay them, it says in verse 3 of chapter 21, because of the oath which their king had made unto Limhi. But they would smite them on their cheeks and exercise authority over them, began to put heavy burdens upon their backs, and would drive them as they would a dumb ass. Yeah, all this was done that the word of the Lord might be fulfilled. So again, the fulfillment of prophecy. So they don't kill them, but they march right up to the edge. making life as miserable for them as they can, which finally leads the people to humble themselves. In verse 14, they humbled themselves even in the depths of humility. They did cry mightily to God. Even all the day long did they cry unto their God, that he would deliver them out of their afflictions. And now the Lord was slow to hear their cry because of their iniquities. So everything that had been foretold comes to pass. They have to learn humility by the things that they suffer. So that is the circumstance into which Ammon comes. The king is out, in the fields outside the walls of the city, and they encounter Ammon. They don't know who he is, and so he's arrested and dragged into the city. Again, there's reference to people looking for Zarahemla, not being able to find it. I think these are clues to the nature of the terrain, topography that they're in, where you get out there for a while and you can't find things. You just can't find your way around, can't find the place that your ancestors came from. Things are very, very difficult. I'm not taking a stand here, although I have my opinions about where the Book of Mormon story took place, but I know when I was down in some areas of Central America, in lowland Guatemala, my word, you get out there into these jungles, and you go a few feet, and you just have no idea where you are. Now, some of the local people there who are used to it can navigate it pretty well, but we were always told, don't go in. You'll never find your way out. You think, oh, how hard can it be? Oh, it's very hard, actually. And you can pass within just a few feet of an ancient temple. It's covered over with trees and grass, so you don't even see it. It's a really difficult place to get around if you don't know your way there. So it's striking to me that these people are constantly lost when they get too far away from their home base. But what else do they find here? They tell Ammon a story about something they'd found. They're looking for Zarahemla. They don't find it, but they find something else. What is it they find that's of interest? Well, no one's going to answer. Well, they find the plates. They find an area where there are a lot of bones and ruins, and they realize somebody used to be here. We don't know who they are, and they find the records. They found plates of ore, and this will become, of course, very, very significant later on. And as they hear the story and tell the story to Ammon, he's filled with sorrow because there's been so much suffering, and so much of it was needless. And he's horrified by the wickedness that King Noah got them into. So, well, on, if you don't mind, to chapter 22.
Well, Dan, let me pick up on what you're saying there about Noah leading the people into wickedness. I think it's a really important and interesting part of the Book of Mormon, where it's starting to point out some of these political problems, and how much trouble Noah created for them, and maybe how much trouble was created in being subjugated to the Lamanites, and under King Laman, kind of brought into slavery. So in verse 30 of Mosiah 21, it talks about how Noah and his priests had caused the people to commit so many sins and iniquities against God. And then later in chapter 22, verse 1, it says, Ammon and King Limhi began to consult with the people. They did cause that all the people should gather themselves together, and this they did that they might have the voice of the people concerning the matter. So they start to kind of develop a sort of democracy in trying to make the decisions. And then in chapter 23, verses 6 through 8, Alma, when the people want Alma to be the king, and he says, Behold, it is not expedient that we should have a king. For thus saith the Lord, ye should not esteem one flesh above another, or one man should not think himself above another. And then verse 8, if it were possible, you could always have just men to be your kings. It would be well for you to have a king. So these ideas of democracy, of equality, and of being responsible for our own decisions start to develop through this episode of the people going out into the land of Nephi and then returning into Zarahemla, so that by the time they get back to Zarahemla and they explain to King Mosiah everything that's going on, King Mosiah says, that's it, we're doing away with kings.
Yeah.
And that's where he institutes a form of judges that are elected by the voice of the people so that there will be no inequality.
Yeah.
So in verse, in chapter 29, and I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I'll just quickly mention it again. He talks about how the kings can cause people to have sins or to do sin, and then the iniquities answered upon the head of the king, because the king's causing people to do bad things. Kind of reminds us maybe of the communities of Sodom and Gomorrah, or maybe at the time of Noah, that people just didn't really have a chance to exercise their agency in a way that made them accountable for their own sins, and so God kind of started over. And so Mosiah is recognizing this problem can be created by an unrighteous king, and he says we need to make sure that people are responsible for their own sins. He says, I desire that this inequality should be no more in this land. I desire this land should be a land of liberty. And so we have a sort of a democracy where they're electing, really a representative democracy. They're electing judges. But then this comes up again in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 101, verses 77 through 80, where it says that this is the reason the Constitution was founded, so that everyone can be responsible for their own. They're responsible for themselves, according to the moral agency which I have given unto him, that every man be accountable for his own sins in the day of judgment. And so this is a very important episode in the Book of Mormon's history, because this is where very much of the political thought that comes into the creation of a system of judges and following the voice of the people it is developed. It's because of this episode with Alma and the unrighteous kings like King Noah.
Yeah. One thing that I notice about the argument for doing away with inequality, you see it very clearly here. In chapter 23, Alma is speaking from the perspective of a subject. He was a prominent subject. He was one of the priests, very much in the king's court. But he says, look, kings are a problem because remember the iniquity of King Noah and his priests. I myself was caught in a snare and did many things which were abominable in the sight of the Lord. So he sort of blames the king for his, leading him astray. So he's complaining about the evils that a king can do. When Mosiah ends the kingship, he says, yeah, I want to do away with inequality. But he's speaking from the standpoint of a king. And it's really striking to me that one of the elements of inequality that Mosiah wants to get rid of is the idea that the king bears responsibility for the iniquity of the people. He says, this inequality is not right. I mean, he's speaking in a sense, I don't mean to minimize it, but in a sense from class interest. He's a member of a very small class, the monarch. And he says, I want everybody to be responsible for their sins. So they're both coming at it, but from a different perspective. Mosiah says, it's not fair. The king should bear the blame for things that his subjects do. So I want equality in this land. I don't want my sons to go to hell, basically, because the sins of the people fall upon them. Where Alma is saying that the evil that a king can do. But Mosiah is looking for the interest of his own family, his own posterity, who are in the monarch business, right? And he says it's not fair. It's just not fair. So I want to do away with that. I remember I wrote something on this a number of years ago where I compared it to Henry V. There's a scene in Henry V. of Shakespeare where the king on the eve of a battle is moving in disguise among his subjects, and they're all saying, well, we don't know if the cause here is just or not. It might be. And if it's not just, well, the blame for it rests upon the king. And Henry V is objecting. Why does it all rest on me? Again, it's the voice of a monarch who doesn't want that responsibility in that sense. I thought it was really interesting that that Mosiah comes at it from a very different perspective in a way than an American Democrat, small d, would. He's looking at it from the standpoint of a monarch. We don't have very many United States monarchs, but this is one who doesn't like the system because it's unfair to him. So,
well, Dan, that's really interesting too. In light of something I heard Terrell Gibbons once say about the war in heaven. And we often talk about the war in heaven as being this system where Satan wanted to force everyone to be good. and that was the way in which he was destroying the agency of man, was saying, I'm going to force you all to be good, then you all go to heaven. And Terrell Gibbons says, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that people would be fighting over that kind of system, that we're fighting for it, that I want somebody to force me to do things. And he says it makes more sense to me that what Satan was suggesting was that anyone could do anything they wanted to, and that would have no consequence. And so that would be the way in which he would be destroying the agency of man, is telling everyone, do whatever you want, and there's going to be no punishment. You'll all go to heaven regardless. And that is, we talk sometimes about modern governments, trying to use force, and that's kind of a continuation of the war in heaven. And maybe that's right. I think also something we see in modern society is the concept that we ought to be able to do whatever we want to without consequence. Yeah. And that if that is also a way of kind of destroying our agency by teaching people that whatever they do is okay and that there's no evil in it, that's also a continuation of the war in heaven. And you see it come up a lot, very common. People, in the political rhetoric and the kinds of things that are suggested, that we ought to be able to do what we want to, as long as we don't hurt anyone else, do whatever you want, and that there shouldn't be consequences of that. And of course there are consequences. There are natural consequences, if nothing else. But we see these things come up again and again, and we will be held accountable. And that was the problem, of course, of Satan's plan, is that you just, it goes against the laws of justice and nature and doesn't work. So it's interesting how these things keep coming up.
Yeah, you can destroy agency in a couple of ways, I suppose. One, you can try to take it away, but the other is just say it's pointless, it's meaningless. Make any choice you want. It doesn't matter. We're not going to respect your choice. So, yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. Well, we're actually running a little bit low on time. So, are there any things that people want to say about chapter 23? I mean, a lot of this is pretty straightforward storytelling. It's great narrative, but I don't know that it needs us to explain what's happening, because it's clearly written. In chapter 24, though, you have another twist where Alma and his people come under the domination of.
If I could just interrupt a moment here, Dan. Yeah. Just one quick comment from chapter 23. I think it's important to note that with verse 21, the point that the Lord seeth fit to chasten his people, he trieth their patience and their faith. Nevertheless, whosoever putteth his trust in him, the same shall be lifted up at the last day. Yea, and thus it was with this people. We have here the people of Alma who have repented. They're trying to do what's right. And then all of a sudden the Lamanites come, and now they're in bondage. So often we see people who have strayed from the church, or perhaps have not been members of it. They turn their lives around, they repent, and then bad things happen. Or even it can happen in anybody's life, and the impulse is to think, well, why? I'm doing what's right. Why is this now happening? And the people of Alma could have easily thought the same thing. But the point, and I believe it's made in the Sunday school, the teacher's manual, is that there are still consequences from our previous choices. They follow us. We can repent, we can have the burden of sin lifted, but the consequences that we were already speaking about here tonight aren't always taken away. It's not that this means we're not doing the right thing. It doesn't mean that God doesn't love us. It's that he has to allow consequences of our choices to come. Sometimes those consequences are delayed. But the point that we see very clearly is that the Lord will then support us through those consequences. And if we trust in him, then just as he did with the people of Alma, he will make the burden light such that we can't even feel it on our backs. And ultimately, he will deliver us. So when these consequences come, when these trials come, the question isn't, why me? The issue is, how can I trust the Lord and turn to him for his help through it?
Dan, your mic.
Okay. I'm not touching it. I don't know how I keep getting muted there. My hands are nowhere near the mute button. Anyway, we are running out of time. We've actually gone fairly long, so I want to wind it down a little bit. But in Alma chapter 24, of course, we find that Amulon and the priests find themselves in a position of power over the saints. And I think that's a good point, that just because you take upon yourself a covenant doesn't mean everything is going to go swimmingly well for you. Members of the church still have challenges. We still have health difficulties. We still have family issues, economic setbacks, and so on and so forth. That happens. When you join the church, you shouldn't imagine that everything is just going to be perfect for you. We still have challenges to overcome. That's how we grow. I used to tell people when I was a bishop, some of them had serious challenges, and it was cheap for me to talk to them in a way. I mean, easy, because I'm not suffering with the things they are in these cases. But I say, well, look, it depends on how you respond. If you go to the gym, you don't lift quarter-pound weights. You try to get some resistance. It's the resistance that makes you strong. It's the resistance that develops capacity. And again, I know it's easy and cheap for me to say it, but if you work against resistance in the eternities, you develop the character that comes from that. And easy for me to say, hard to live, but nevertheless, that's the principle. And so, it would be wrong if the Latter-day Saints living righteously were to have no challenges. That's the only way we can develop. We don't like it when it happens, but it does happen, and we understand for our good. And someday we'll think, yeah, it was. In the midst of it, we usually don't feel that way. Thank you, Lord, for the challenge. Could you take it away now? Amulon, some priests these are. It's very revealing that in verse 11, the people have begun to cry mightily unto God. Amulon forbids them to pray. You know something about the nature of the priests of King Noah, that they could come in and forbid people to pray. And nevertheless, they do get away. Deep sleep comes upon the Lamanites, and they're delivered out of bondage. So they escape, and that's the end of that story, that particular part of the story. Any comments, I think, before we wind this down and bid one another adieu? Anything anybody else would like to say? It's a wonderful set of chapters with just a wonderful storyline, very dramatic, and yet plausible, believable, and
well, Dan,
a lot to learn from. Yeah.
Dan, let me just maybe reiterate something that McKay was saying, maybe in closing here, that as the priests, that Amulon and his priests were putting all these heavy burdens on the people, they had this kind of perception that God was going to make those burdens light. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 15, it says, the Lord did strengthen them, that they could bear up their burdens with ease. And they did submit cheerfully and with patience to all the word of the Lord. And so sometimes the Lord does make our burdens light, and then other times He's making us stronger and able to carry those burdens. And so, sometimes it may be best, rather than praying for lighter burdens, which, as you say, they're maybe not going to help to strengthen us. Mm-hmm. Instead, maybe we should be praying for stronger backs rather than lighter loads.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think. And I think that's one of the points of Earth life, is to develop stronger backs, to be able to deal with challenges and setbacks and so on. And so everybody gets them, you may think. I remember when my wife and I were married, the fellow who performed the ceremony was talking about how, you'll face challenges, be sure you meet them together, and so on and so forth. And I remember thinking, arrogant young twit that I was, what can there be? I've led a pretty charmed life. I'm in good health. Everything will be fine. And then as you go along, you do run into things that just sometimes can knock the wind out of you. And I think everybody does. And if they haven't, they will. It happens to everyone. But those are the moments, in some ways, where you grow the most and develop the most strength, if you survive the challenge. It's all a matter of how you how you face it, how you withstand it. So that's an important lesson from these chapters. Well, I think we have gone about as long as we dare go, unless, are there any absolute closing comments that anyone would like to make? Okay, well, I would like to thank everybody for being involved in this. Again, from, at least on my screen, from left to right, Martin Tanner, McKay White, Steve Densley, I'm Dan Peterson. This was the 163rd Scripture Roundtable produced by the Interpreter Foundation. There are a whole lot of others with a lot of good material, a lot of good discussions, and we like to hope and we believe that they can be of some use to people out there. We certainly enjoy doing them, even if no one else likes them. We have a good time discussing these passages. Wonderful, wonderful things in the Scriptures. So thank you very much.